There comes a moment in the history of every nation, just as there is in the life of every individual, when denial is no longer an option, when the weight of truth presses in so forcefully that we are either crushed by its reality or awakened by its presence. Today, we are witnessing something historic, profoundly unsettling, yet deeply instructive. The very foundations of Israel, long regarded as immovable, are now trembling. Not simply because of political turmoil or military challenges, but because of something deeper, more existential. The collapse of vision, the erosion of meaning, and the decay of collective responsibility. This is not merely a geopolitical analysis, this is a moral reckoning. For decades, Israel stood as a symbol of resilience, identity, faith, and survival, built out of unimaginable suffering, carried forward by a relentless will to endure. Its story inspired the world. But now we must ask, what happens when a nation forgets the principles that gave it life? What happens when tribal loyalty supersedes truth, when fear replaces faith, when strength is no longer guided by wisdom? You see, collapse never begins with bombs or borders. It begins within. It begins in the soul. It begins when we stop telling the truth, when we refuse to carry the burden of history with dignity, when we trade responsibility for ideology and virtue for power. And so today, I'm not here to simply declare that the collapse has begun. I'm here to challenge you, whether you are Israeli, Arab, Christian, Muslim, atheist, or otherwise, to look into the heart of this crisis and ask, what can we learn from it? How can this unraveling awaken us, not to destroy, but to rebuild, not in arrogance, but in humility, because make no mistake, the collapse of a nation is not just about them, it's about us. It's about what we tolerate, what we ignore, and what we become when we forget who we are. A nation does not fall because of sudden catastrophes. It begins to unravel long before the collapse becomes visible. The most dangerous threats to a society are not those that come from outside its borders, but those that quietly corrode it from within. Moral decay is subtle, insidious, and often masked by the illusion of progress or the distractions of power. When the shared ethical structure that once bound people together begins to erode, everything built upon it starts to falter. It begins with small compromises, truths that are bent for convenience, traditions dismissed as outdated, and values sacrificed for short-term gain. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a deeper malaise. A people who abandon their sense of right and wrong, who forget the sacred responsibility to uphold what is good, inevitably lose the compass that guides them through chaos. In the case of Israel, what we are seeing is not just political instability or military vulnerability. We are witnessing a spiritual fragmentation. The collapse didn't begin with missiles or international condemnation. It began when foundational principles, justice, unity, discipline, sacrifice, were replaced with partisanship, pride, and ideological rigidity. When loyalty to a political narrative supersedes loyalty to truth, a nation no longer has a firm ground to stand on. It begins to fracture along lines of race, religion, class, and creed. The common cause that once united people in hardship and perseverance gets replaced with tribalism and resentment. The collective is sacrificed on the altar of the self, and when that happens, the structures holding society together become brittle and ready to snap. The heart of a society is not its borders, its military strength, or its economic output. It is the moral vision of its people. Without a coherent moral framework, every institution eventually becomes corrupted. The justice system turns into a weapon for the powerful. Education becomes indoctrination rather than illumination. Media shifts from informing to manipulating. Leaders no longer serve. They rule. Citizens stop being participants in the story of the nation and become spectators of its decline. And all of it happens while everyone insists things are just fine, because the moral collapse is the hardest to see and the easiest to rationalize. Children raised in morally chaotic environments grow up disoriented. They lack the structure necessary to develop resilience, discipline, and purpose. When a nation loses its moral clarity, it produces generations of people who are uncertain about what is worth living for, let alone what is worth defending. This internal confusion leaves a country vulnerable, not just to external enemies but to its own collapse from apathy and confusion. Israel, like any other nation, cannot survive if it forgets the values that gave it life. Survival alone is not enough. What matters is how a nation survives, what it protects, what it teaches, what it stands for in times of peace and times of war. Once moral decay sets in, it doesn't stay confined to abstract philosophy or theological debates. It manifests in how people treat each other. Corruption becomes normalized, integrity is mocked. Public service becomes a path to personal gain. The citizens begin to lose trust, not only in their leaders but in each other. Trust is the lifeblood of any functioning society, and when it evaporates, fear and cynicism take its place. People withdraw from civic life, stop engaging in dialogue, and start viewing their neighbors as threats rather than partners. The social fabric tears not in dramatic moments, but through 1,000 quiet betrayals of conscience. A people who lose sight of their moral responsibilities soon find themselves governed by those who are willing to manipulate, exploit, and divide. And those who dare to speak truth, those who call for a return to principled living, are branded as radicals or fools. Yet history has shown, time and again, that every civilization that collapses begins with this same pattern. The outer signs of decline, economic downturns, military defeats, cultural fragmentation, are merely the results of a much deeper internal crisis, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of morality. Without moral clarity, there can be no justice. Without justice, there can be no peace, and without peace, there can be no future. A nation cannot survive on fear, anger, or pride alone. It must be built upon something solid, something enduring, something higher than any one leader, party, or ideology. It must rest on truth, and truth is not subjective. It is not whatever we wish it to be. It is grounded in reality, in tradition, in the accumulated wisdom of those who came before us. When a society forgets this, when it pretends that values are optional or negotiable, it invites collapse not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. A nation is not simply a collection of individuals occupying the same geographical space. It is a living narrative, a shared story that binds people together across generations. That story is sustained by a collective identity, an understanding of who we are, where we come from, and what we are responsible for preserving. When this identity erodes, when the weight of history and tradition is cast aside in favor of personal autonomy and fleeting convenience, the society begins to lose coherence. The erosion of collective identity is not a sudden event. It is a slow, persistent forgetting, a gradual replacement of shared purpose with fragmented ideologies. When the people of a nation cease to believe in a common future, the nation itself begins to dissolve from within. Responsibility is the cornerstone of a functioning civilization. Without it, liberty becomes license, and freedom degenerates into chaos. In a healthy society, responsibility is not seen as a burden to escape, but as a noble duty to embrace. Citizens carry the weight of the past and the hopes of the future in their daily actions, understanding that the stability and prosperity they enjoy were purchased through sacrifice and maintained through discipline. But when the idea of responsibility is discarded, when people come to see themselves not as stewards of a great tradition, but as isolated individuals entitled to pleasure and protected from discomfort, everything begins to unravel. Institutions that once depended on trust, commitment, and service become empty shells, performing their functions without meaning or moral grounding. Israel's strength has never been merely military or political. Its true strength lay in its collective sense of identity, forged through centuries of suffering, perseverance, and unwavering connection to history. When that identity begins to fracture, when factions within the nation define themselves more by their grievances than their shared destiny, the country becomes vulnerable, not because of external enemies, but because its people no longer believe they are part of something greater than themselves. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and division rooted in forgotten responsibility is the most dangerous of all, for it does not come from outside pressures, but from a loss of will within. Every generation must earn its inheritance. It is not enough to receive the fruits of prior sacrifices. One must understand and uphold the values that made those sacrifices meaningful. When responsibility is no longer transmitted, when identity is treated as a relic rather than a legacy, young people are left adrift. They seek belonging in ideologies that promise liberation but deliver only confusion. They are taught that history is oppressive, that tradition is shameful, and that progress means the rejection of anything old. But this mentality does not liberate. It isolates. It replaces the deep, binding roots of identity with shallow slogans and temporary allegiances. A nation that forgets its story will soon forget why it exists. When identity becomes politicized, when it is wielded as a weapon rather than lived as a commitment, it loses its power to unify. Instead of asking, "What must I do to preserve what is good and true?" individuals ask, "What am I owed?" And this mindset, though seductive, is corrosive. It undermines the very spirit that built civilizations, the willingness to serve, to sacrifice, and to bear burdens for the sake of others. When responsibility is displaced by entitlement, institutions rot, communities fragment, and the nation drifts without a moral compass. In moments of crisis, societies with strong collective identity and shared responsibility rise above division. They draw on their sense of unity to weather the storm, to hold fast when everything around them is shaking. But societies that have lost that foundation flail and fracture, turning on themselves in confusion and fear. The absence of responsibility manifests in every sphere: political leaders who manipulate rather than serve, educational systems that indoctrinate rather than enlighten, media that incites rather than informs. And all of it flows from the deeper reality that people no longer see themselves as guardians of something sacred, but as consumers in search of comfort. The restoration of any society begins with the restoration of responsibility. It is not imposed from above. It is chosen, lived, and taught from one generation to the next. Without it, identity becomes a hollow symbol, and freedom becomes a burden people are ill-equipped to carry. Responsibility is the weight that gives life meaning. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests. And when it is abandoned, collapse follows, not in a flash, but in a slow, steady unraveling of everything that once held a people together. Truth is not a luxury. It is the essential foundation upon which all lasting structures, be they personal, cultural, or political, are built. When truth is denied, twisted, or hidden, the very mechanisms that hold civilization together begin to deteriorate. It begins subtly, almost imperceptibly, when people grow weary of the demands truth makes on their conscience. To live truthfully requires courage, discipline, and the willingness to accept discomfort. It demands that we confront our own shortcomings, question our assumptions, and speak honestly even when it is costly. But in a society that elevates comfort above responsibility, truth becomes inconvenient. It becomes something to be edited, manipulated, or ignored in order to maintain a sense of ease, control, or ideological purity. The denial of truth is never neutral. It always comes at a price, and the longer it is denied, the heavier that price becomes. In the context of a nation, when truth is suppressed, whether by government, media, or the collective will of the people, the consequences ripple outward through every institution. Political discourse becomes performative rather than principled. Education becomes about indoctrination rather than inquiry. The justice system becomes selective, favoring narratives over facts, leaders begin to tell people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear. And the population, increasingly confused and misinformed, loses the ability to distinguish between propaganda and reality. In the case of Israel or any nation on the brink of internal collapse, the denial of truth is not just a side effect of decline, it is the cause. When a people refuse to confront the reality of their internal divisions, moral failures, and the consequences of their policies, they are choosing blindness over vision, and blindness, over time, leads to destruction. Truth acts like a mirror. It shows us who we are even when we'd rather not see. But if we smash the mirror because we don't like the reflection, we are left stumbling in the dark, guided only by ego, fear, and illusion. The most dangerous lies are not the ones we tell others. They are the ones we tell ourselves. When a nation begins to believe its own myths to the exclusion of uncomfortable realities, it grows arrogant, brittle, and intolerant of dissent. It becomes incapable of reform because it no longer has the humility to admit fault. The truth is not kind, it is not accommodating, but it is the only path to genuine healing, growth, and renewal. Any attempt to build a future while standing on falsehood is doomed to fail, because that future will lack coherence, trust, and integrity. People often seek refuge in narratives that affirm their world view, especially during times of uncertainty. But truth does not care about ideology. It does not bend to suit political agendas. It is stubborn, relentless, and often painful. And yet, it is only by facing it that individuals and nations gain the clarity needed to make wise decisions. When societies abandon truth, they trade long-term stability for short-term emotional satisfaction. They silence voices that challenge them. They marginalize dissenters. They reward those who echo the dominant narrative, even when that narrative is built on deception or wishful thinking. Truth requires infrastructure. It needs institutions committed to transparency, individuals committed to honesty, and a culture that values reality more than comfort. Without these, truth becomes irrelevant, lost in a sea of noise and distraction. People stop asking hard questions. They stop listening. They retreat into their ideological tribes, each convinced of their righteousness while the foundations beneath them rot. The longer a society denies truth, the more difficult it becomes to recognize it when it finally emerges. And by then, the damage is often irreversible. The collapse of a nation that has denied truth is rarely dramatic at first. It manifests in small ways: rising distrust, economic instability, cultural fragmentation. But over time, these cracks widen, institutions fail, people lose faith not only in their leaders, but in each other. The social contract dissolves. Truth, once a shared value, becomes a source of division. And without a common understanding of reality, there can be no meaningful dialogue, no compromise, and no path forward. The society becomes paralyzed by suspicion, resentment, and confusion. When truth is lost, so too is the capacity for self-correction. Every error is repeated, every lesson is ignored. People cling more desperately to ideology, even as the evidence of its failure mounts around them. Denial becomes the default posture. Accountability disappears. And eventually, the gap between perception and reality grows so vast that collapse becomes inevitable. Not because the society was attacked, but because it could no longer face the truth about itself. Collapse, while devastating in its surface appearance, is not always the end. In fact, it is often the beginning of something new. When the structures that once defined a society fall apart, when its politics disintegrate, its culture fragments, and its institutions lose the trust of the people, what remains is the raw foundation of what could be built again. This foundation is not made of policies or ideologies, it is made of meaning. Out of collapse comes the demand, the urgency to rebuild, but not to rebuild for the sake of preservation or nostalgia. Rebuild with intention, with truth, and with meaning at the center of every brick laid. In the aftermath of societal failure, illusions are stripped away. The false securities people once clung to the stability of leadership, the predictability of the economy, the reliability of long-standing institutions, are revealed to be fragile. That revelation, though painful, is necessary, because only when a society sees clearly what is broken can it begin to reconstruct what is true, and that reconstruction cannot be shallow or cosmetic. It must reach deep into the moral and philosophical frameworks that define human purpose and collective identity. If the next iteration of the nation is not founded on a renewed understanding of meaning, the same collapse will repeat itself under a new disguise. Meaning is not something given from outside. It must be discovered, claimed, and lived. It is found in responsibility, in truth, in the pursuit of the good, even when that pursuit requires sacrifice. After a collapse, when the familiar is gone, the temptation is to despair or to grasp at easy solutions. But those who emerge from the rubble with clarity are the ones who ask the hard questions. What truly matters? What principles are worth rebuilding around? What values must never again be compromised? These questions are not political, they are moral, they are existential, and the answers to them form the blueprint for renewal. There is a deep paradox in collapse. It is at once a death and an invitation to rebirth. For those willing to endure the loss of certainty and the pain of disillusionment, there lies the rare opportunity to start again, not with arrogance, but with humility. Meaning cannot be imposed by force or manufactured by propaganda. It must be grown through personal commitment and collective resolve. A society cannot recover its strength through legislation alone. It must rediscover the sacredness of truth, the necessity of sacrifice, and the dignity of responsibility. These are not abstractions. They are the moral muscles of civilization, and without them, no structure can stand. Israel, like any nation facing collapse, stands at a crossroads. On one path lies deeper fragmentation, fueled by bitterness, fear, and a refusal to learn. On the other lies the painful but vital work of renewal. Not the kind of renewal that simply restores what was lost, but the kind that transforms what was broken into something more resilient, more honest, more aligned with what is right. That path requires courage, moral courage, to face the past without distortion, to speak truth in a culture of denial, to act with integrity in a time of expediency. It is not a path for the faint of heart, but it is the only path that leads to genuine rebirth. Rebuilding with meaning begins on the individual level. No law, policy, or leader can substitute for the inner transformation of a people who have chosen to live truthfully and take responsibility for their future. Every generation inherits both the wounds and the wisdom of the past, but it must decide what to carry forward. If collapse is a signal that something essential has been lost, then recovery is the process of recovering that essence. Not through force or fury, but through disciplined clarity, moral resolve, and shared purpose. When meaning is placed at the center of national life, when education becomes the transmission of wisdom rather than the distribution of information, when leadership becomes service rather than domination, when freedom becomes responsibility rather than license, then a nation does more than survive. It thrives. It becomes a place where suffering has purpose, where struggle leads to strength, and where collapse is remembered not as a final defeat, but as the beginning of a deeper awakening. The history of human civilization is marked not only by its victories, but by its recoveries. By the moments when people, shaken by collapse, chose not to give up but to rise. Not blindly, not defiantly, but with open eyes and renewed hearts. Meaning is not found in avoiding collapse. It is found in what we do when collapse comes. It is in how we respond, how we rebuild, how we refuse to let the story end in despair. Collapse is not the end of the story. It is the moment when the real story can finally begin. In the end, the collapse we witness is not merely the fall of a nation. It is a profound warning to all of us about the consequences of forgetting who we are and what we stand for. It reminds us that no power, no army, No ideology can sustain a society that has lost its moral foundation, its commitment to truth, and its sense of shared responsibility. Yet, within this crisis lies a choice: to succumb to division and despair, or to rise with renewed purpose, courage, and clarity. The path forward demands that we face reality honestly, reclaim the values that once united us, and build a future grounded not in fear or falsehood, but in meaning, integrity, and collective will. This is the challenge and the opportunity that awaits us all. The question is not whether the collapse can be stopped, but whether we have the strength to rebuild something better in its wake.